In this lesson, I want to look at the three most common modifiers known as accidentals. The first one I want to talk about is a sharp, which looks like this and means that you would raise a particular note going up by 1/2 step. So if you have an F, the sharp as a modifier would modify that note to F sharp. Or if you put a G, or a sharp on a G, then you would modify the G to G sharp. Let me show you how that's going to look on the staff. Here I have for you our grand staff, and if I were to draw for you a G, that would be a white key on the piano. Now if I go ahead and modify it with a sharp, that would raise the G up to a G sharp. Now I want to stop here for a moment and notice that the sharp on the staff is always written before the note. So there's a sharp and then the note. However, when we write it with our Arabic numbers, we write G first, and then the sharp comes after. So a lot of people confuse that and try to write a sharp before there, or maybe they write the sharp after the note. But once the note's played, you can't modify it. So you always have to modify the note before it's played. So on the staff, you always want to put the accidental right before the note. Now the next accidental, or the next modifier, is called a flat. And it looks kind of like this. It looks almost like a B, but it's tilted a little bit. Now just like the sharp was a modifier to go up, the flat is going to modify the note down. Imagine if you're driving around and your car gets a flat tire. Well, the car tends to sink down. And in music notation, it's the same thing. When we have a flat before a note, our note goes down. So let's take the same note, which was G, and let's put our modifier of a flat right before that note. Now that makes it a G flat. And again, notice that when I'm writing on the staff, the flat comes before the note, but when I'm writing in Arabic numbers, the flat comes right after. So that's a quick little guide that is very, very important, and I hope that that helps to alleviate some confusion. The other modifier that's most notable is called the natural. Now a natural is used to cancel out a previous sharp or a previous flat. So let's say that in a piece of music, I was writing a melody, and let's say I wanted to make my melody E flat to a C. And then the next time there was an E, I wanted it to actually be an E natural and not an E flat. So what I would do is I would modify that by using a natural sign, which would then cancel out the previous flat. If I don't have this natural here, then the next E would actually be flat as well. Even though most composers won't write in that second flat, they'll just leave it blank. That still means that we keep all of the notes with that modifier modified until we see a bar line. So if we were to write music, and let's say I have my E flat again, just for the sake of ease, I have an E flat here, but then there's a measure line or a bar line, and in the new measure I just write that. Well, it wouldn't actually be an E flat until I wrote it in again. So if I just wrote this like this, then the first time we play an E flat, and after the bar line we would play an E. Now most composers will be really nice and they'll write the natural sign in between or for the next measure, just to kind of show, okay, this is an E natural. So just to be very careful that it's not an E flat. But technically we don't have to do that. We can just leave it blank in the next measure, and then let's say in the next measure we want an E sharp, so we can modify it like that. But the accidental or the modifier carries throughout the entire measure. There are some other accidentals that I want to look at, but these are less common. Now let's say we want to go, for whatever reason, from this note to an F sharp. Well, if we can't use an F sharp, there are things that we can do in order to modify a note to get to a different note. So like we were talking about earlier, we can use a sharp to create a half step above that note. But if we want 2 half steps, we can use what's called a double sharp. Now the double sharp looks kind of like an X, and the double sharp means that you would actually play a whole step above the note that's written. So if I write an E and then I put a double sharp in front of the E, that note is no longer an E, and it's not an E sharp, it's actually going to be an F sharp, which would be this note here. However, we wouldn't write that note, but this is the inharmonic equivalent of that note there. Now the same is true for the flat side. We have an accidental called a double flat, and much like the double sharp, it does the same thing. However, the double flat makes the note modify in the opposite direction. So if we have our trusty E, we're going to modify it now with a double flat. Now this note is no longer an E once we modify it, but in fact it's going to be equivalent to a D, which is that note there. So a performer would see this note on the staff, they would be translating that in their head to a D. Now this often happens with our scales. There's some odd scales that we'll talk about later that actually need to use double flats and double sharps. But for our purposes, I just want you to be aware that those exist. Those are probably less common than the sharps and the flat, but you do see them popping up every now and again. The last thing I want to show you is that when we're working with all of these accidentals, be it a sharp or a double sharp or a natural or a flat or a double flat, the key ingredient or the key element that I want you to focus on is that the accidental has to be in the center of the line or the space that you're modifying. So for example, if I use the bass clef, because I've been using the treble clef a lot, if I use this E, if I were to modify this and put a sharp, I want to make sure that the two lines on either side encircle or encapsulate that note. Now if I use a flat, it's going to be the same thing. I want to make sure that my flat encapsulates that circle. So just for an example, to give you a bad example of what you shouldn't do, you shouldn't just put it like up here, or you shouldn't put it real far down below, because then that gets a little bit confusing. So you always want to be really neat and tidy with notation and try to modify the space that the note is on. Now for the line, it's the same thing. If we were to use, let's say, this line here, which would be an F, and let's draw a natural. Now the natural has to be right in between the line, or the line should be dissecting the natural rather, in between. Now if we're going to use a double sharp or a double flat, it's the same thing. We want to make sure that the X is right there in the center of the note we're modifying. Again, just to give you a couple examples of what not to do, we don't want to put a double sharp down here when our note is F, and we also wouldn't want to put a double sharp way up here when our note is down there. Now you might think that's pretty easy and obvious, right? But oftentimes even I make this mistake when I'm going really fast, and I'll write a melody or a harmony, and let's just say I'm writing, I'm composing, I'm just kind of sloppily writing what I can do, and then I'm trying to modify some of the notes, and I'll go through kind of not paying attention, and I'll put like a flat here, and then a sharp up here, and then a natural here, and then when it actually goes back for a musician to read this, it can actually cause some confusion because they think, well, this doesn't really make sense, it just looks like chicken scratch. So even though you may know what you mean, it's really, really, really important to be as clear as possible, because ultimately the idea of notation is to translate your ideas or your song, your melody, your piece of music to somebody else to play. So you want to be as clear as possible. There are actually notation systems out there, I won't name any, but there are a couple notation systems that are really popular for actually creating a computer type, so that you don't have to worry too much about handwriting everything. So if you're getting to the point where you're tired of handwriting, you can look up some of these softwares and purchase one or try a free one, and you can actually engrave some of your notes so they look like professionally printed music. Well, that was a brief overview of some of the most common accidentals that we use in music. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, please reach out. And again, I hope you really enjoyed watching this. And let me know if you have any questions.